Hello and welcome to Libero. I have no idea what number. This is the podcast about the least important of the most important things, as Mary Earps once wrote in her autobiography and then regretted. That story's mad. The person giggling is Jonathan Wilson of the Jonathan Wilson Industrial Complex, and the person chuckling elegantly and gracefully is John Brewin, who's physically of London, but spiritually is enjoying an Aperol Spritz in Robbie Savage's house in Macclesfield. How are you both?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Yes, I am well. Robbie, let me correct you. I know you're a close personal friend of his, actually, closer than I am. Lives in the village of Prestbury, a very nice house.
He does, that's true. I mean, Macclesfield is the kind of the tip of Cheshire's Golden Triangle, isn't it? It's one of the, whereas Robbie is very much a central character to it.
Yeah, Macclesfield is the market town and the areas of Prestbury and Aldley Edge. Actually, the real money is where the Rooneys live, is sort of Knutsford way. That's where there's big farmland. That's where you can build like a, Hollywood star-style condominium where no one can ever get close to you, sort of thing.
Yeah, there's a place called Holmes Chapel, which has got some mad houses in it. Have either of you two been at a football match this week?
I'm going to Newcastle Athletic tonight.
Oh, nice.
No, I'm not doing a Champions League match this week, but I'm back on the B teams this weekend. Listeners will be glad to know. But it's Burnley this time. They're at West Ham. A 6-pointer. A battle of claret, which may be very confusing for, David Cameron. Is he still in his shed? Or is he come out of that now? Or has he gone back to the shed?
You don't hear much from Cameron these days, do you? You don't. No. He doesn't stick his head above the parapet, particularly. Just before we start, and we are discussing the other B teams, not Burnley, but West Ham might feature, to be fair. Just a quick check. This week, Bayern Munich broke a record. They've now started the season with 16 wins in a row, having beaten PSG on an eventful evening for Luis Diaz on Tuesday night. Just a quick check. Is that a good thing for European football, that records keep falling and teams to win 16 games in a row? Is that healthy? Is that something we should be pleased about?
No. The thing is, if this was some sort of organic thing, this group of kids had grown together and were playing brilliant football under an inspirational and innovative coach, and they found a new way of playing, then that would be amazing. But it's not. It's just they're wealthy and they've actually used their wealth for once quite well. And they're playing great football. That's not untrue. But I think we also saw PSG don't really know how to defend. Which has been a habitual problem of theirs. They've managed to clear it for the last 3 months of last season. But they sort of were quite complicit in Bayern's, certainly in the first goal last night. So, I mean, PSG will win the French league without having to play well in the first half of the season. That's also a problem.
Yeah, I would say that's true. Although Marseille are putting up a bit of a fight, so it might at least get to quote John quoting me, it might be interesting for a while, but it does feel a little bit like the old PSG rope-a-dope tactic of last year is being deployed again, where they're not great until kind of December, January, and then suddenly they're the best team in Europe.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, Bayern's executive board get a lot of criticism, but they actually chose quite well with Vincent Kompany, didn't they? It was one out of left field. It was one which he was way down the list, and it was certainly a risky appointment, but the recognition that maybe he could work with better players playing that game appears to have gone well. And Bayern is often an unhappy ship, but they actually seem happy at the moment, which hasn't been the case for a long time, it feels.
This may be a question that none of us can answer, actually, but I do wonder whether there's more scepticism around Vincent Kompany's Bayern being good in Britain than there would be anywhere else in Europe, because we are naturally so kind of drawn to what happened with Burnley, which was that they played nice football and got very easily relegated. So it feels maybe to us as though he's a less convincing coach than it would if you weren't primarily thinking that guy used to be in charge of Burnley.
I think that is true. I think also the fact that Harry Kane's scoring all these goals, we know Harry Kane. We've seen all the good things he does. We're aware of the flaws he has. Yeah, if this was a player we hadn't seen week in, week out, we hadn't seen him playing for our country, we would just think that's incredible. He's scoring over a goal a game. He's unstoppable. But we know he's Harry Kane, and we know that eventually his ankle will get injured. He'll play when he shouldn't play, and everybody get very frustrated. Also, the fact that we saw Bayern last season being pushed to the limit by Celtic. It's quite hard to take a team seriously when that's true of them. I mean, they're not St Mirren.
Stephen Robinson, St Mirren, as you have to describe him in Scotland. That's interesting about Kane. Like, if you think about his goal scoring record this season particularly, it's very Lewandowski, but he doesn't have that same kind of aura as Lewandowski maybe because he's not quite as exotic.
I'm sure that's true. And also, Jack makes the point. Kane is obviously the best English player at the minute and has been for a long time. And when somebody actually says it, well, obviously it's true. And yet maybe it's because England still haven't quite won something, and therefore the leaders of a team, you sort of see deficiencies in them. I think also Kane is sort of, it's not his fault in many ways. It's sort of to his credit. He's quite uncharismatic. He's a very ordinary bloke. He doesn't sort of gleam with sort of some kind of star quality in the way that Lewandowski does or Haaland does. He seems, I hate using the word humble of footballers because I don't think it's ever true. But there's a weird normalness about him. The fact that he's married to his the girl he met at school. There's no sort of flamboyance or glamour to him, which is fine. That's good. It's great. It's probably one of the reasons why he's so successful. He's not getting distracted because he basically just likes scoring goals and he studies how to score goals. And I mean, even that's unfair. I'm sort of diminishing him because he actually does have far more to his game. The way he drops off, the way he spins, the way he plays in players who run behind him. I'd say he's probably quite a good captain. He's quite an understated leader, but he's not a star. He doesn't have a star personality.
So just to be clear, you're absolutely not advocating that Harry Kane should leave his wife. That is not your... That is,
no.
If he wants more attention, leave your wife.
So long as they're happy, which they, as far as I'm aware, they are. I can't say I've given it any attention. But no, if he is in a happy relationship, he should remain in a happy relationship.
Yeah, I do wonder whether the ordinariness of Kane holds him back, that there isn't that kind of... He's not difficult, he's very quiet. Whether he's humble or not, I don't know, but he's a nice bloke, Harry Kane, when you meet him, but he's probably a bit boring, if we're all completely honest. And I wonder whether there's a little bit of that. And also, his great skill, his superhero quality is his reliability, isn't it? And that's not devastatingly sexy.
With Kane, Jonathan and I were at a game on New Year's Day. Was it 2015, Jonathan?
I was literally just thinking of this when he tore Chelsea apart. We were sort of giggling away, going, "He's the greatest living Englishman." Put him on the banknotes because neither of us could work out why he was any good. And since then, we've both had to go, actually, no, he is really good, but he doesn't have one outstanding quality, right? He's sort of 8.5 out of 10 at absolutely everything, and maybe 10 out of 10 in terms of some kind of intangible. His brain, his reading of space, his commitment to getting better at the scoring of goals.
The thing is, in English football, we have this obsession with this sort of ingenue, don't we? So he's not a Rooney, he's not a Bellingham, he's not a Michael Owen, and he's actually quite an ordinary player. Ordinary, but also extraordinary in his output. In that game, he was absolutely devastating. And sometimes when you see a player so young be so brilliant, they have a lot to live up to for the rest of their career. And he's lived up to it in terms of his stats. Unlike someone like Wayne Rooney, he's actually got to over 30 and continued that output. And the thing is, we saw, didn't we, with the Haaland revealing his lifestyle. What these lads have to do, they have to be boring. Now, Erling Haaland has a sort of a bit more of a jagged personality that comes out, in interviews or whatever. But Kane is entitled to be himself, and that's it. And there is no doubt that after Euro 2016, which was a disaster, he's been the best English football, the most consistent English football, and we'll look back at him and think the records speak for themselves. He's been an absolutely brilliant player for England and every club he's played for, or the two clubs he's played for.
I think that's absolutely right. But this is not a Harry Kane podcast. We are going to talk, as I mentioned, about what we refer to on Libero, I think, as the B teams. But I'm going to present the subject in the style of a 1950s documentarian, so just bear with me. I'm not in a scene, I'm not in a full Horncastle. Fuck off, Chelsea FC, you ain't got no history. But what if having no history is an advantage in modern football? We talk a lot about the B teams, but maybe we should think of Brentford, Brighton and Bournemouth in particular as the blank slate clubs. They're often grouped together as the kind of the data set, aren't they? They're the teams that do data with a capital D. And that is the kind of explanatory cause of their success. But is there another factor? Is the fact that they are all historically, and I'm going to have to couch this really carefully, relative minnows in the English game? Is that a significant part of what has enabled them to become what they are and what they represent in modern English football? is it better at the moment to, historically at least, be relatively small, John?
On our last discussion, Jonathan introduced the idea of fast and slow thinking, of how maybe direct football represents maybe some sort of political aspect. I think these clubs represent the way we're in a tech era of business. Yeah, so disruptors. A lot of the time, the tech comes from small companies, the disruptor producing the innovation, and then, and this is the sad fact, they eventually get swallowed up by the major corporations. So Instagram comes out, is bought up by Meta, which has first mover advantage, and WhatsApp and stuff like that. And so what will happen, I predict, is people will start copying these models, though no one's quite got to the bottom of the Tony Bloom model just yet. But at the moment, because you've got that blank slate, you can innovate. You don't have so much friction. You're not turning around the Queen Mary as Sir Jim Ratcliffe has to do at Manchester United. And the pressure is less on you. And as a result of that, and the thing is, a lot of the time with disruptors and inventors, there'll be a lot of failed attempts out there. Look at Southampton, just got rid of Will Still. And a lot of clubs are trying to do this because it's the way forward. And we're in a tech era, and football is not the only industry to operate on tech guidelines these days. And that's eventually the big clubs will all operate like that as well.
I think that theory is more convincing than Wilson's political fast and slow thinking, fast and slow football theory. But that's a different subject. Jonathan, would you agree with John? Is this basically football's version of disruption?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's Tony Bloom can buy the club he supported, and he can sort of do what he wants with it because it's Brighton. They don't have dozens of directors and coaches and scouts and former players who've been there or connected to the club for 30, 40, 50 years who were all someone, this is how we used to do it. Yeah, so Alex wouldn't have done it like this. Yeah, there's nothing to go back to. So I mean, I remember after Valery Lobanovsky died, Dynamo Kiev had this massive problem that every single person they appointed as coach was a former Lobanovsky player, and every single one of them, when faced with a crisis, asked themselves, what would Valery Lobanovsky have done? And the problem is the solutions that were right in 1988 weren't necessarily right in 2003. And Dynamo went into a slump, a comparative slump by their standards. And it was only when they brought in Yuri Siemin, who was from Moscow, had nothing to do with Lobanovsky, that they actually sort of got a bit of clarity and started winning things again. It's a fairly sort of standard pattern you see in all kinds of walks of life. Somebody has loads of success, but then that starts to weigh them down because they're not thinking clearly when a new crisis arises. They're saying, well, what did we do before when we were successful? Well, maybe that doesn't apply to this crisis. Whereas if you've got a clean slate, you can do what you want. Now, sometimes that will fail and we don't notice that, but when it succeeds, it's much easier than when you have all these different parts that are all sort of embedded. Changing a big institution is incredibly difficult, whether it's a football club or anything.
Yeah, no, I think unfortunately for fresh conversation, the best example of that is probably Manchester United, isn't it? That they have, I always think there's kind of a yin and yang in football, where if you have the privilege of having a great player at your club, when they retire or are sold or get injured or whatever, or diminish in some way, you suffer a bit because they aren't there anymore. And the price you pay for having had the privilege of watching that player play is that maybe your midfield's a bit shit for a while. And it's the same with the manager, isn't it? If you have a great manager, there is a hangover period to that in general. Miguel was here, he might suggest to us that kind of the shifting economic landscape of football is changing that, and I'm sure that's probably true. But historically, teams have great managers, and then when that era ends, it is difficult to recapture the magic and the glory. And United are the best example of that, I think, because certainly until Amorim and that, there remains a question mark there, it does feel like they've basically been trying to channel the spirit of Fergie ever since 2013. So you get his anointed successor in David Moyes. Then you try and get the big beast manager in Louis van Gaal. Then the charismatic Mourinho, I think that's the right order, isn't it? He's replaced by Solskjaer, who is literally just saying, well, look, he liked it here, everyone likes him. He played for Fergie, that'll do. And he comes in. maybe with Ten Hag, you can say they're starting to break free and trying to make a sort of modern appointment. But they have been hamstrung by the idea that there is a correct way to do things at Manchester United.
Yeah, I mean, Ten Hag again was this idea that they've always got, that he's a young manager with progress to come in his career, and he's not, which fits Ferguson, it fits Matt Busby, it fits Tommy Docherty, it fits even Big Ron Atkinson was a young manager with progress to come. I was thinking about Manchester United, and this is reflected in other spheres, so art, film, music, or whatever. When people become successful, they try to second guess themselves, don't they? Say someone like, I don't know, Ricky Gervais, The Office. Like The Office is probably the most quoted in the world of the social media. The Office is probably the most quoted thing, isn't it? And it feels like Ricky Gervais is trying to relive that. He's trying to second guess what made him funny at the start, and he's not quite hitting it. There are very few people, there are very few artists that are prepared to fully reinvent themselves in the style of, say, David Bowie in the 70s. And eventually, Bowie ended up becoming a parody of himself. And that's what Manchester United are at the moment, or have been for a few years, is the parody of themselves. And it's that great ability to innovate, to disrupt, as the word appears to be these days. I always think disrupt means something else, but there you go. Is it possible at a major institution? It's not.
That's a really interesting thought, on music. Because I do wonder to what extent, and this is very much your sphere more than mine, and it's definitely your sphere more than Wilson's, who famously doesn't like music.
He knows a lot about it, though. We were talking about it yesterday. His knowledge is just annoys me, actually, how much he knows about music.
But there is a point where musicians, artists, whatever you want to call them, they're not just writing songs based on kind of what, their heartbreak or, what their nights out or getting a taxi in Sheffield or whatever. They're writing songs because they sound like an Oasis song, or that sounds like an Arctic Monkeys song. They're trying to do the thing that they do. And I think that is definitely true in football, both of managers individually and of clubs in general. It's this kind of, this is a different podcast, but that kind of, or maybe it's not. I always remember going to Norwich, I think for an end of season game, would have been about 2014, 2015, something like that. Before kickoff, or maybe at half time, they presented like the club's under 11s or under 12s who'd won their Premier League tournament or whatever. And the announcer said, these young kids who are coming through playing in the Norwich way. And I remember thinking, well, hang on, what's the Norwich way? There isn't a Norwich way. That isn't, and I don't mean this.
Oh, I think there is, yeah.
Is there?
Yeah.
What is it? What's the Norwich way?
Ian Crook.
Passing football, keep it on the carpet. Yeah.
That's everybody's way.
It's definitely Norwich.
That's not a way.
It is.
No, because United's way is wingers. Like nobody's way is maybe Stoke's way is kind of whack it long to the big man. But there's definitely some clubs are more hung up on this than others. No, okay, the career of Sam Allardyce, despised at West Ham and Newcastle because they saw themselves being above that type of football. People at Bolton loved him because they didn't, and even people in Sunderland, until the present incarnation of Sunderland, Allardyce's Sunderland was the best Sunderland has been since Peter Reid's Sunderland. Nobody cared it was direct. It was successful, and Allardyce is a former player, and him dancing on the pitch with was it actually tied around his head, or is after sort of the caricatures sort of overwhelmed what actually happened. That game at Everton, we were sat next to each other that game, John. It sounds like we sat next to each other all the time. But was his tie actually tied around his head? Because we ended up having a drink next to him in a hotel bar later that night. Him and Jim Montgomery. It was a great night.
Great night. I just remember the dance. That's all.
But was his tie around his head or not?
I can't remember.
Wilson, you did mention privately in a private WhatsApp group that, possibly in relation to this episode, but maybe not, that you think Sunderland, the team you support famously, basically aren't that arsed about style of play, which I think is a really interesting thing for a fan to admit. My guess is most fans would say there is a type of football, and it's normally that they're kind of blandishments. They're not meaningful. It's not a meaningful style of football. It's just we play attacking football, or we pass the ball around. As you say, it'd be fascinating to know actually whether Stoke fans, if you are a Stoke fan, get in touch. Spotify, YouTube.
I have a theory about that, is that they did play nice football in the 1970s when Tony Waddington was a manager. Alan Hudson really stroked it around. And then Stoke obviously got relegated. It was 85. And it was Lou Macari that pulled them up the divisions, and that was a very aggressive, long ball style of football. So maybe they were couched in that by the point Tony Pulis came around. I mean, there was a few avenues gone down, but when Pulis arrived, the fans were, okay, we're not going to have an Alan Hudson anymore. It'll be 20 odd years.
But do we think then that, and we are drifting wildly off topic, although thankfully I think I can get us back onto it through Allardyce's Bolton. Do we think then that now, if a Stoke manager went in and said, we are going to play, possession football, I'll admit I haven't watched Stoke for years, but it's possession football, really patient, ticky-taka, do we think the fans would be like, well, hang on, that's not the Stoke way? Or do you think that they would be kind of approving of it because, and this gets back to the conversation that you two had with Jack on Monday, because there is a sense that is probably how you should try and play football if you can?
I think it depends entirely on results. I think there's a huge swathe of clubs for whom results are the only real thing that matters. And it's almost certainly true that all clubs, if you play quote-unquote nice football, you probably get a little bit more leeway than if you play ugly football. If you play ugly football and lose, there's nothing there for you. If you play nice football and concede annoying goals, people are going to be a bit more forgiving. But I think one of the reasons Sunderland don't care about, Chelsea I don't think care about style. And I think it's to do with not having had recent success. And by recent, I mean sort of between, say, 1960 and 2000. So there's no sort of style to hark back to that's done well. So Sunderland's greatest period was the 1890s. We're not going to go back to playing like the 1890s. In those days, you could take throw-ins one-handed. You really could do long throws in those days.
That maybe that's the next innovation. Let's try and sort of veer back onto what we're meant to be talking about. Otherwise, we'll end up talking about Sunderland, and there's just no listeners in that. Allardyce's Bolton are actually quite a good example of this. Does that again was a relatively historically small team that started with a B and took on this kind of pioneering role, and they weren't popular at the time. And I wasn't a working journalist when Allardyce was in his pomp at Bolton, but I don't remember them being held up as being this kind of, this is the team from the future, but they were doing a load of really interesting, the cliche again. They were doing some very smart stuff with very early data, Allardyce's Bolton. And if you look around football now, there are lots of people who worked with Allardyce at Bolton who are in very powerful positions. I think at least until recently, Liverpool's chief scout was an Allardyce alumnus, as was one of the people really hyping recruitment at Man City. There is a real tale to what Allardyce achieved at Bolton. And that was a small club that a manager who had a set of ideas that were in many ways quite new and quite disruptive, although that term didn't exist then, he was able to shape entirely in his own image without the risk of opprobrium from the fans, without intense scrutiny from the media, and without, as you both said, this kind of sense of, well, this isn't the way we do things. I mean, no one was saying, well, Nat Lofthouse didn't use Pomo, so we can't possibly play like that.
He literally did. He didn't call it that. But
I'm in my 40s, I don't remember. But do you know what I mean? Like, but Allardyce at Bolton was, in his own way, and it's funny, just the way that Tony Bloom and Matthew Benham and Bournemouth are talked about is far more praising than anyone would ever have been about Allardyce at Bolton. But the basic principle was the same.
Yeah, when Bolton first started qualifying for Europe and things, I think there was a lot of, maybe some of it was slightly grudging, but I think there was a lot of interest in what he was doing, because it wasn't just the data stuff, it was cryogenic chambers. I think Allardyce, if he wasn't the first to use them in English football, he was certainly among the first. He was certainly the first to sort of talk glowingly of them. There's loads of stuff like that he was praised for in terms of man management. So things like they'd go on these sort of team bonding weekends where they'd have races on motorised toilet seats. I remember having to write about that. I remember Yuri Djurkaeff saying, they turned up at the training ground, I think it was like December or January, it was like a really horrible, cold, wet day. And they were all sort of, oh God, it's going to be awful training today. And Allardyce looked outside and went, let's have a game of darts, shall we? And they played darts instead of training. He was, the problem is, as we all keep saying, football managers tend towards self-parody. And Allardyce is as guilty of that as anybody. But the younger Allardyce was innovative in a whole load of ways. And, yes, data, yes, sports science, but also, it's not innovative, but you're just smart sort of in his dealings with players. He made it fun for them. Yuri Djurkaeff, Fernando Hierro, Okocha, they went there, but partly because the wages were pretty good, but partly because the word got out, actually playing for Bolton's quite good fun.
I think one of the issues with Allardyce is his defensiveness over his own record. And if he was maybe a bit more relaxed about it, then people would recognise that. And and the other thing is that he is constantly trumpeting the fact that, I pioneered this, or we were doing this ages ago. And actually, he doesn't look like an innovator because he actually sounds reactionary when he's talking like that. But actually, he wasn't reactionary. So the other thing is with Allardyce is that he has a charisma. Definitely, like he's a great talker. He's great on TV. He's good on radio. His podcast is actually very enjoyable. But not everyone. It's not to everyone's tastes. And also the football, as Jonathan alluded to before, the football at Newcastle. I couldn't believe how quickly Newcastle fans turned on him. No, because I was like, but Allardyce is a good manager. He'll get you places. No, we're not playing that football. And West Ham,
former Sunderland player as well, though, which didn't help him.
Of course, yeah. But West Ham, there was this sort of grudging acceptance that, yeah, it'll get us to where we want to be, but we don't want him around that much. And there were always these, he cocked it. There was a game where I think they actually beat Hull. A game where they beat Hull and he got booed off and he sort of cocked an ear to them. And it was, it really didn't go very well for him in terms of PR there. But he was a good manager for West Ham. I think they would grudgingly accept that now.
The thing about self-parody that Wilson mentions is a long-standing theory of mine that managers, the course of a manager's career is basically towards their priority moving away from winning football matches to proving a point. I think that's true of most managers, that they want to prove that their idea is the best idea. That becomes their overriding factor late on in their careers. To defend Allardyce a little bit and all other managers, I do wonder whether, like West Ham, when maybe West Ham and Newcastle scarred Allardyce in the way, maybe managers have these experiences that scar them so much because it feels like they are being criticised and being kind of abused in a way, despite trying really hard, despite getting, in some cases, decent results, maybe not fulfilling ambitions. They see the full context. Maybe, maybe their transfers are not, their transfer ambitions aren't supported by the club or whatever. Maybe they understand that, the role that injury plays a little bit more, or they feel cheated by fortune. Maybe that's what forces them into becoming these because I think a lot of it is rooted in paranoia. Maybe that's what forces them into it. The scars become so painful, the wounds that they've sustained over the course of their career, because it is a real pummeling you get. Maybe that is what explains that descent into self-protection and self-parody.
I don't think any of that's untrue. I think it is true. I don't think it's the only thing, though. Maybe you're right. Maybe football is such an oddly bitter, difficult world that is what goes on there. But I just think what happens is people get successful, and then they start to think that they're successful because of what they've done, which often is true, and so they think their way of doing things is right. And so when a problem turns up, they don't think what's the right way to answer this problem. They think, what's the most characteristic way to answer this problem? And I think that's not unique to football managers. I think, John mentioned it earlier. I think it does relate to, the way that in music or film, people are producing for an audience. And, I find Tarantino films now almost unwatchable because it seems just a mishmash of other stuff I've already seen from Tarantino. And I find it bizarre that, I read an interview with him recently where he was saying he thinks Once Upon a Time in Hollywood's his best film, which I think Jackie Brown's by miles his best film. And I don't really like anything he's done since, because Jackie Brown seemed to be where he reached that. And again, this is not a new thought, but young people have energy and creativity and imagination. Old people have craft. And at some point, the two lines cross, and that is where you're at your peak. And that was where it seemed to me the energy of Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction meets the craft, and that is therefore his best film. Since then, the energy's gone. He's replicating old ideas, and I think football managers, the same thing happens. That you bring in Martin O'Neill at Celtic, he knows how to be a football manager. He's been a football manager for 30-odd years. So in a crisis, his sort of "this is how we do things" has a good chance of soothing the troubled waters. But he doesn't have the energy, doesn't have the imagination to take them forward, as I'm sure he is well aware, and Celtic must be aware.
So maybe that's another factor that enables smaller teams to be disruptors because they are able to take a risk. This is a really kind of real stretch of a segue. They are able to take a risk on managers who do not yet have the craft, but do have the energy and the ideas. Whereas I think instinctively, teams that are historically considered larger, that have more pressure, have more scrutiny, will always tend toward caution and experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, bigger clubs will tend to go for someone who, even if they come from a smaller country, has to have the experience of a bigger club. So Ten Hag would be an example of that. There's this idea that Ajax is this great big, almost Man United style ship, so therefore Ten Hag should be able to cope with the pressure. It turns out the pressure was very different. And I mean, Ajax, the pressure on that club is huge, but it's still nothing on Manchester United. That's the big issue, isn't it, with football clubs, is it's turning that stuff around. And again, to go back to that example of music or whatever, it's how many times have you seen this? Like, this is back to basics. This is a rock and roll album from us. We're going to go back to do the way we did things the old way. And they just can't help themselves sometimes. And maybe we talk about Bayern Munich doing something slightly different, an interesting thing. Well, there's a major club taking an innovation.
Although only under duress, because they did try and appoint 8 other managers before Vincent Kompany. They kind of got there by accident.
They tried to get Tuchel back, didn't they, at one point? So, yeah.
The problem for big teams is if they appoint from beneath themselves, for want of a much better phrase, immediately that manager's under pressure. You're seeing it with Thomas Frank at Tottenham now. And it was always going to be the problem. But Tottenham fans, the Tottenham environment, fans, media, whatever, maybe even players, they think, hang on, this bloke from Brentford. As soon as things go wrong, it's like, is he big enough for us? And so he's not given any time to learn. I think particularly when he's coming from within your own league. And yet the truth is the most successful managers tend to be those, well, they almost have to be those you've appointed from beneath. So, Tottenham's most successful manager recently is Pochettino, who they get from Southampton.
I mean, it's mad, isn't it, when you think about it? Because if you appoint from, an up-and-coming manager in your league, the doubts as soon as they lose a game are, well, this is too big a job for them. If you appoint a manager from abroad, then it's, well, they're not used to the league. It's too difficult. Premier League's too difficult. Basically, every club should fire and then reappoint. They should do the Wolves model. They should do the Wolves thing where they fire Gary O'Neill, appoint someone else, fire them, and try to rehire Gary O'Neill. Maybe that is what clubs should do. They should have like 2 or 3 managers who they just rotate between.
Well, the truth of Wolves now is the best qualified manager for the job is Vitor Pereira. He's exactly what they need.
Vitor Pereira of a year ago, sack him, bring him back. There's something very, like with the Wolves situation, has been treated as this sort of bizarre unicorn type thing in England. It's all very Italian.
Yes.
I mean, if Horncastle was on, he's not. He's wandering about the Galleria in Milan this week with his doodle glasses on for some reason. But this happens weekly in Italian football, that a club will sack a manager and then rehire someone who they all are basically already paying. And it's partly because they're, headstrong and willful and knee-jerk, but often it's because they're also thinking, well, hang on, we're already paying that guy. Let's not pay another one. We might as well just, get him to do some work for his gardening league.
I know you like this comparison, but it's the Paul Heckingbottom, Chris Wilder thing, isn't it? You've got a rotational there. Some managers suit a club, and that's one of the things. And I think the Thomas Frank thing, it is incredibly premature to start criticising them. He's taken over a team that was absolutely dreadful in the Premier League last season. Okay, he's struggling a little bit to find a pattern of play, which isn't necessarily his thing. He's a pragmatist. I do think at Tottenham, the fans are unrealistic in their expectations. And also, what about the fact that, okay, the manager before that they got rid of, you won a trophy, just maybe enjoy it. I mean, it's difficult. It's hard easy for us to say as journalists, and we've all been fans, but it's like, things are good, things are okay. I mean, they beat Copenhagen quite.
Martin Samuel's written a piece about this in the Times this week about the instinct to boo. And I think he undermines his argument's solid, except he undermines it by using West Ham as an example, sort of saying, they beat Newcastle at the weekend while fans were protesting. Therefore, the fans shouldn't have been protesting, which I think is, well, I don't want to say anything too strong, but I think it's just a terrible argument. It's obviously West Ham fans have a right to protest. That club has been incredibly poorly run for a number of years. And the fact they won one game, clearly you shouldn't be like, well, we're not going to protest because all right, we've had 6 years of mismanagement, but but we've beaten Newcastle, who are knackered. That point undermines the argument. But I think he is basically right that football fans really love booing now. Like the default setting for quite a lot of fans seems to be complete dissatisfaction at all times. And as Martin writes, like a really sudden desire, not sudden, like an overwhelming desire that you are ready to boo as soon as something bad happens. And I think that's what the Thomas Frank situation reminds me of at Spurs, that people kind of, the trigger was cocked effectively. As soon as something started going wrong, there was a dissatisfaction that was waiting to be expressed.
But I think why are we using these two examples? Why are you using Spurs and West Ham? One of the reasons is they are the two clubs in the Premier League whose stadiums are most out of sync with the actual status of the club. And that's part of what we're talking about, where the weight of the club's history, expectation, the weight of the sort of culture around the club makes it really hard to get things right. West Ham, I think this is right. And last season, I think they had the 9th highest average attendance in the world. It's ridiculous. And equally, Spurs have pretty obviously the best club stadium in England, well, best stadium in England. They're not the best club in England. West Ham are not the 9th best club in England. And that creates this pressure of expectation, which means that it leads instinctively to a conservatism, that if you make too big a change, if you do something too radical, immediately people kick back against it because there is this expectation of success, and success instantly.
But that's it, isn't it? It means that there are lots and lots of people who are waiting to criticise. It's a numbers game to an extent, that if Spurs lose a couple of games on the bounce, or if West Ham have a bad season, the expectation is high. The number of people engaged with that process is high. Therefore, you are at risk of a real kind of backlash. And that affects the way that teams think. So you are much more inclined to be risk averse, I think. Whereas if you're Bournemouth and your stadium holds 11,000 people, or if you're Brighton and all of your fans remember playing at the Withdean, the other one, Falmer, and the days when they almost went completely bankrupt, and Des Lynam had to save them or something, then you're much more willing to accept the ups and downs, the circuitous route, and you're more likely to be willing to embrace a new idea.
Just to be clear, I think West Ham are badly run.
But you're also great these days, Wilson, at attendance figures. Just your stat the other day, I can't remember when it was, about River Plate having the highest average attendance in the world. That is a great bit of information.
It's almost like I've just filmed a documentary entirely based on that fact.
Yeah, I mean, but it's just good how you're not telling anybody about it. John?
I was going to say, I mean, I recently did a podcast with some Brighton fans, and we talked over this idea of the well-run club. And they're a bit bored of the cliche, of the idea of, oh, yours is a really well-run club, isn't it? And that they are bracketed with Brentford, with Bournemouth. And they said, well, people don't actually know that much about us, do they really, apart from that we're a well-run club. And that they think it's lazy, it's a cliche, and that there's a bit more to it than that. I mean, I'm actually in a position where I go to Brighton a lot, so I can actually get away with pretending to know a bit more about it than that. But it is true. And, Brighton do have a history. It might not be a glorious history in those terms, but if you've been a Brighton fan for 30, 40 years, as some of these chaps I was speaking to, there's a lot to go off. And the Bobby Zamora era, Mickey Adams, all that stuff. And before that, Steve Foster, all that stuff. There is this idea, isn't there, that, okay, we've waited a long time, we've got to this point, and also expectation will rise at a certain point, because it's like, hey, we've been this really well-run club. What about us getting into Europe every season or something like that? And that might be where the model breaks down, because there's only so much room, and you're only a bad managerial appointment away unless your system is absolutely foolproof. And so far, Tony Blue's system appears to be foolproof, but time will stress test it to the extreme, won't it?
I think the other thing that's really interesting about the B teams, that cast of clubs, is what's happened on this podcast, is that they're actually quite a good way of talking about the bigger teams.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of the time, discussion of Brighton or Bournemouth and Brentford and what makes them so great turns into, well, but the problem with Spurs is this. I mean, to be honest, I get the fans' complaints that, and Miguel's mentioned this as well, that like a lot of people say, aren't Brighton clever, without explaining why Brighton are clever other than, oh, they have data. And there's an element like you can't do much about that if Jamestown won't tell you what they're doing, and they won't. Even Miguel doesn't know what Jamestown are doing. He might be closer than most of us, but even Miguel doesn't know what they're doing, because it's proprietary and they make a lot of money out of it. I think to an extent the mystery is not a great one. It is that they are very well run.
Do we know why they've named it after a notorious massacre?
I think it's the road on which the company was formed, rather than a sort of homage to
Jim Jones and Kool-Aid.
But maybe that's it. Maybe we have all drunk the Brighton Kool-Aid. Maybe that's why they've done it. We're going to take a break much later as I try and wrestle this podcast back somewhere on track. After that break, we will be listing clubs to make ourselves sound clever. Welcome back to Libero for our abbreviated second section. Jonathan and John are with me. Remember to like, subscribe, Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, X, Blue Sky, Instagram. We're on them all, even TikTok, although I don't have that one, so I don't know what we do on it. We really appreciate your support, your comments, your remarks, your ideas, your feedback. It's all really welcome. We love doing this podcast and we love having a community of people around it who are so engaged. I wanted to live down to my stereotype by just throwing out the names of some hipster clubs across Europe who were quite good, a bit like Brighton and Brentford. Leipzig, boo. Hoffenheim, smaller boo. Villarreal, cheerish, bit boring, but cheer. Atalanta, big cheer. Everyone loves Atalanta. Sassuolo for a while, not so much anymore, although I think they are in a kind of upswing rather than a downswing at the moment.
Good Phil Collins tune.
Which one? Oh, I see. It's a Susudio joke.
Yeah, sorry.
But even teams like Union Saint-Gilloise, who obviously have a Brighton link, there are lots of sides around Europe who are, I think, fair or could fairly be characterised as blank slate teams. You know, clubs that have historically very small imprints compared to, you know, the traditional giants, the traditional elite, who have been able to take that path of Bournemouth and Brentford and Brighton. They might not all begin with B, but they are all B teams. And that it is a thing that is happening across Europe, that the traditional barriers of entry to the kind of elite have faded away, because if you've got a kind of a shortcut, an advantage, a competitive edge, you can have access to the same amount of money as quite a lot of teams in your league pretty quickly, which means you can sign players that are just as good. And if you are, or even better, and if you are smarter than them, then you will do well. This is a thing. This is a phenomenon of modern football, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's a paradox there, isn't there? That as Miguel will tell us, and he is right, the game has never been so determined by money as it is now, and yet there's also an opportunity there for these, let's call them disruptors. And I guess they've always existed to an extent. You know, on Monday we're talking about the days when Watford and Southampton were finishing second and third in the first division. Or, you know, you'd look 20 years before that to Ipswich. Even Nottingham Forest, the late 70s, I mean, not quite as dramatic as Ipswich, but a team getting promoted, suddenly winning a league. Small teams, medium-sized teams. What was the euphemism you used earlier, Rory, which was quite useful? Relatively small teams.
Yes.
Relative minnows, suddenly doing really well. That has been a feature throughout football history. They're more striking now because it is apparently so difficult to compete with the big teams. And the sides that we're seeing struggling are sort of the middle tier, who have a weight of expectation in the history, but don't have the dynamism and the flexibility and the maneuverability of a blank slate teams.
Yeah, I want to come on to my sort of anti-Goldilocks idea that we discussed literally in the minutes before we started recording this podcast, Jonathan. It's a hot theory. It's literally just been invented. But I mean, I was going to throw in a couple of other names to that kind of historic list. Parma, who were, you know, one of the Sette Sorelle, the giants of Italian football when we all started watching Italian football. Parma historically are not a big club in any way. It's a beautiful city. It's a lovely city, but it's a very small city. And they weren't, you know, if you go back through Italian football history, they were not a kind of big traditional heavyweight. They just had the backing of Callisto Tanzi. The Parmalat Empire turned out to be a blessing and a curse. But they were in the 1990s capable of signing Hernan Crespo, Ariel Ortega, Zola played for them, you know, all these incredible names. And they were in that when their fortunes were changed by external investment. And to be honest, you can probably say the same for the European champions, Paris Saint-Germain, that they historically are not a big club. They're a club in a massive city with a huge catchment area and massive potential. But historically, before 2012, they would have been what? Marseille were the biggest club in France. Saint-Etienne, I think, was still the most successful, maybe them and Lyon or Marseille. And PSG would have been 4th or 5th on that list, I think. So this blank slate idea has been around for a while, and it continues to echo into our present.
Yes, it does, yeah. Let's start with Chelsea there, shall we? The 2003 purchase by Roman Abramovich is essentially buying a club which has no money, no investment. Ken Bates and his regime had spent up, essentially. There were some foundations in the fact there were some good players there, but what they were able to do was revolutionary, and they're able to turn over a good training ground. They're able to professionalise a club that you listen to Chelsea players from that era. They used to train on a park. Chelsea almost became that model that Manchester City followed, and again, City was an opportunity because they had the Commonwealth Stadium in essentially brownfield site. You're able to build what you like as long as you're investing in that local community. And City are the example of having huge investment and getting it right. Now, Miguel can talk about money being the big factor, but actually it's smart money is the real deal in football, isn't it? Because
petrol and ideas, as Wenger put it.
But the difference, I guess, between City, Chelsea, PSG and the B teams is their disruptive influence is having loads of cash, as I guess you'd say was true of Parma. So there is a slight difference. Are you doing it because you have loads of money and are prepared to spend it, and in the days before FFP and PSR were able to spend it pretty much as you wished, or are you disrupting by being cleverer? And those are two different things.
You spend it well.
Well, sure, but it's... But did Chelsea spend in 2003 when Chelsea went on that? What was it, 160 million they spent that first summer, which at the time was nuts money. Well, did they spend that well, or did they spend lots of it? They spent lots of it.
Yeah, and they got some right because eventually, if you throw enough darts, you're gonna hit a bullseye.
I
Do you know
think
what I mean?
got more
they signed
right
Adrian Mutu and
More right than wrong, but it was a weight of cash rather than they weren't identifying 17-year-old Paraguayans. It's.
Yeah, the money itself had a determinative factor, didn't it? Or a determinative quality. Like if you spent...
They were able also to develop this youth system, which actually now helps fund the club now. So the foundations were laid upon that, and City have done the same. I mean, there's a lot of players in the Premier League that are, Morgan Rogers would be an example. Players that have come through the City system that have gone elsewhere, which is the way it used to, Manchester United, ex-trainees used to be very highly regarded. It's now City, it's ex-Chelsea players that are much highly regarded. The foundations were laid by this with the B teams, with our the disruptors. It's a slightly different thing, isn't it? The youth. I mean, Brighton have produced a couple of young players. Hinchelwood would be one. Evan Ferguson, brought over from Ireland, would be another. But it's not the youth team that people buy from. It's actually the scouting system that other teams are feeding off on it, the bigger teams, that's actually keeping them through because otherwise you've got PSR as well, which means the churn has to be a big part of it. Whereas PSR was not an issue for City and Chelsea.
But even if you take, and I think, Jonathan, that is a totally valid point, that the disruption was we have more money than you and we can spend it and we can afford to sustain the mistake. So even, for every Mateo Kesman, there was a Joe Cole or a Damien Duff, which means that eventually you will get it right. It feels the Premier League in that era, I think, has a lot of parallels with the WSL now, where if you put enough money in, you can become very successful very quickly. Like if as a fan, it's a source of genuine shame to me that the way Liverpool treat their women's team, when you think, well, actually, if you gave them 10, 15 million quid now, maybe prices have gone up, you could get a really competitive side instantly. And I think Chelsea was similar. But if you take Chelsea and City as disruptors of a different sort, and then Brighton and Bournemouth and Villarreal and Atlanta and all this, they have changed, I think, the landscape of European football. And as you mentioned, Jonathan, the clubs that have suffered are not the titans of the game, because Liverpool and United and Arsenal and Milan and Inter and Juve and Real and Barcelona and Bayern, they're too big to fail effectively in any meaningful way. But the cast of clubs just below them, the teams who were traditionally the aspirational clubs, so in England you'd maybe say Everton, Spurs, possibly West Ham. And then in Germany, I think there's loads of examples. Hamburg, Cologne, Werder Bremen, Schalke. that kind of second, Hertha Berlin, that second.
Köln are back up, are they 7th at the minute? But they have come back. But all of these have been, and Hamburg are back up as well, aren't they? But all these were in the second division.
Hamburg, they've all spent time they've all been relegated. They've all spent a decent amount of time down there. Hamburg are the best example of it, because Hamburg are a former European champion who, in 1982, 1981, broke the European transfer record. They were a genuine superpower, Hamburg. But because they haven't had that, because they've had that kind of, that anti-Goldilocks spot of not having enough money to ride out any sort of problems, because they've got the weight of history holding them back, saying there is a way we have to do things, because they have all the scrutiny, all the pressure, they have been caught out by this shifting of the landscape. And I think just as if you look across Europe, you can see a range of clubs who fulfill the category of Brighton, Bournemouth and Brentford. There are lots and lots of clubs across Europe, Real Betis, Fiorentina are 19th in Serie A.
I think they're bottom, actually.
They're bottom now. They lost the Lecce the weekend.
Yeah, Verona are 19th. Yeah, they're behind Verona, yeah.
So Fiorentina, although Fiorentina, to be fair, have had 2 or 3 decent seasons, largely making the Conference League final and losing it.
Sampdoria, bottom of Serie B.
And then in the Champions League, you have Ajax and Benfica, and when we're recording this, they are the bottom 2 in the flyleaf table of the Champions League. It's those upper middle class clubs who have been caught out, who have suffered. That is the big change in the last 20 years of football, I think.
But I think the Ajax Benfica issue is related to the Celtic Rangers problem. It's slightly different to a Fiorentina or a Sampdoria or a Köln or a Hamburg, that they are the big teams, one of 2 or 3 giants in their leagues. And I think they almost lose a sense of purpose. What's the point of winning 40 domestic leagues when we're really struggling to make any impression in Europe at all? And they get caught up in this sort of, they have to beat, if you're Ajax, you have to be better than Feyenoord, you have to be better than PSV. And then but hang on, but now we're not even better than Karabag. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I think it's a slightly different category problem to the Sampdoria, Fiorentina, Köln, Hamburg problem.
Those are both 2 clubs in need of severe modernisation, aren't they? I'm not sure.
Well, Ajax especially is so, like what I was saying about Dynamo Kiev before, it's exactly the same thing. It's not what would Lobanovsky have done, it's what would Cruyff have done.
Yeah, but Cruyff's The Telegraph column is no longer written anymore, is it? So that's the thing. That's where they got their guidance from. So it's like, and Jose Mourinho, I mean, if we're talking about people making a parody of themselves, he's in that sort of De Niro, analyse this, analyse that period, isn't he? Where he's sort of mocking himself as a gangster. I mean, it's like if a massive club is trying to turn itself around, Jose Mourinho is not the answer. I'm sorry. He might have been the answer in 2004, but he's not now, is he?
I think there's other factors at Benfica which are related to kind of the economics of football and the way that agents operate and that the president, the transfer market, all that stuff, which I think we should probably do a full podcast on Benfica, to be honest, as it is a really interesting case. I'm annoyed with this because we've got to almost an hour in. And Ajax are the perfect example of this. They are the club that are most, I think, hidebound by tradition. There is a sense that Ajax are not Norwich. There is an Ajax way, and they are held to it. And watching them in whatever their last Champions League game was, what really struck me when you saw the team was, apart from like Kenneth Taylor, who was Chelsea actually, when they got smashed at Chelsea, there's very few like Dutch kids coming through because they've tried, and Jonathan's right, I think, to chase this idea of we have to beat Feyenoord and PSV, we have to win the title, and we have to be competitive in Europe. And the way to do that is to try and source talent from all over the world. And I do wonder whether Ajax's thing, the modern periods where Ajax have been successful, is when Ajax have said, this is the thing that we do. And much like Athletic Club de Bilbao, as pretentious people insist on making us call them, Athletic's like model of only playing Basque players, I think is really interesting because it's in effect saying to the fans, there will be good years and bad years. You are completely dependent on what the Basque country can produce and people who are sort of brought in because they're just about Basque enough. But you're not going to be able to win the title every year, so you have to kind of recalibrate your expectations. I think if Ajax did that and said, look, we're totally reliant on de Comps, the academy. It will depend on what we can produce, but that is who we are. This is what we do, and this is how we want to be. You would have good years and bad years, but I think fans would probably enjoy it more.
Yeah, and I think that's how they used to be. I mean, this is a huge topic that we haven't got anything like time to go into now. But I think it's related to I think the crisis in Dutch football is related to the crisis in the sort of Dutch body politic that, they had this idea of Nederland Gietland. The Netherlands are a guide country. We're not big enough to win stuff, but look at us because we're doing it the right way. And now, the rise of the far right there, okay, the recent elections have knocked that back a bit. But this idea of the Dutch as being this proudly progressive, tolerant nation, that's been severely challenged. The self-image has been challenged. And it's been challenged in football as it's been challenged in terms of immigration policy and things.
We've gone from Sam Allardyce's Bolton to Dutch immigration policy. That's Libero. Thank you to John. Thank you to Jonathan. Thank you to you for bearing with us. Sorry I lost control of this episode. See you next week.